Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge & Company. Katrina Heuvel is the editor of the weekly magazine The Nation. The Nation's voice has never been stronger, and its circulation is the largest it has ever been. And yes, it is filled with most important ideas. But the editor also has a quaint custom about political writing. She wants it in English. And that's what it is. Each week, this woman of the left is ready for all comers. Welcome, Katrina.
Thank you.
What a responsibility that is.
A political weekly, especially in these times, and especially one that is independent, but in our times, on the left, on the liberal, progressive side, it's a challenge. But these are, I guess Confucius said, these times of challenge are also times of opportunity, and people are interested in the politics in ways that I haven't seen in
a
years.
long time. I was going to ask you if this isn't the time that the need for the nation and also the response to it is. I can't remember any time that's been quite like this time.
And I would date it not just from September 11th, which is so seared in our city's memory and our country's memory, but also since election 2000, when the country went through a trauma. I think, historic, where the magazine played an important role in challenging the outcome, continuing to believe that President Bush, was an appointed president by his Supreme Court. But more important, since September 11th, the media hasn't really lived up to its role of challenging the conventional wisdom, challenging the government's line, the fear of speaking out and articulating an alternative to kind of an endless war. The fear of being called unpatriotic, un-American is still, seared in our genes in a way, even though, it's the end of the Cold War, 10 years later, et cetera. That charge is very strong.
But I think it's been that way longer than 2000. I would put it back further. I think that the Democratic Party losing its spine and its personality, and the movement to make Democrats more like Republicans, more mainstream, the interpretation, and I think it was basically an interpretation by the political leaders that that's what the American public wanted. I mean, that's been a drift.
Absolutely, and tracking it just in terms of the magazine, when Bill Clinton was elected for his first term, the magazine circulation took a drop, as did other public interest groups, whether it was the ACLU or the Sierra Club, because there was a view that now that there was a Democrat in the White House, all problems were going to be solved. Well, that changed in about 6 months, because it was clear that the Democratic Party for years has not spoken up for ordinary working people against a plutocracy, has not spoken up for what we call, as we write an editorial this week, the kind of primary of ideas, or a vision primary. Instead, we now have a money primary, we have a horse race primary, we have a primary who can hire the consultants. You lose the citizens in that process, and you lose your political orientation. So yes, however, I will say at the magazine, which had a vigorous debate in 2000 in terms of Al Gore versus Ralph Nader, the third party candidate, I am on the side of, yes, this country needs a multi-party system, but at the moment, the rules are such that it's rigged against that. So when my daughter says the other day, why isn't an independent also going to run in 2004? I try to explain. And the magazine fights for an openness of our democracy, but at the same time recognizes that we need to work within the system we live in.
But it's so interesting, because I'm much older than you are, and I go back longer. And I mean, I grew up, I was born on Franklin Roosevelt's birthday, and I grew up through the New Deal and everything. But I also was always an activist from the time I was 21 or something. Anyway, I remember the McGovern reforms of the Democratic Party. I remember the Chicago convention, and when we determined we had to change the rules of how we were going to nominate a candidate so that we didn't have the bosses controlling. And what we've come up with is something that's really not a good alternative.
It's a system.
It's all money and fortitude and the organization you can put together, and it's a very damaging thing. I think if we had had a different kind of I don't know what would have happened.
It's a system in lockdown, really. It's a system. It's a fragile, crippled democracy. One of our great political correspondents, William Greider, wrote a book maybe a decade ago called "Who Will Tell the People." At the moment, we have within the Democratic Party what the late and great Senator Paul Wellstone described as the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. There are still people within the party, maybe 40 in the House, 10 in the Senate, who speak to those values and the vision. But the party has moved rightward, for want of a simple term, and lost its ideals in the process, to the point where I'm of a different generation, but I was raised in a family where Franklin Roosevelt was an idol, Bobby Kennedy. If you look at what Franklin Roosevelt said in Congress, or to the people on radio chats, he'd be considered a radical. He'd be driven out of Washington today.
Absolutely.
And so you have to sort of wonder how this trajectory occurred. And obviously what you said about activism. I'm so heartened today by, the protests in our country, the largest protest in Washington since the Vietnam War. Even before war has started, if it starts, you want that energy, you want the activism, because you don't push a political system without activism, without energy. And that is arising not just in campuses, but you see in church groups, in labor movements, in women's groups, in environmental groups. Some of it, I think, is the extremism of this administration, the Bush administration. This is an administration out of sync with the mainstream values of most Americans, put aside the progressive left people in this country.
I agree. I'm totally in agreement with you, but I think also that we have to find the way to talk to those people in the middle, because we do have. I've always been fascinated with the term progressive versus liberal. I consider I cringe a little bit with the term progressive, because it seems to me, although I'm progressive, very. I always feel like I'm a rebel in disguise. I wear a velvet jacket, so you don't, and I'm a little older, so you don't realize it. But I think we scare some people who used to be that traditional core of the Democratic Party with some of the labels that we use.
I agree that the labels are difficult, and I think some of it is the media needs shorthand, political people, players, but there's citizens out there who don't define themselves in those terms, who want to hear, for example, take social and economic justice, something that would define a liberal or a progressive. But if you speak to a middle-class American in this country about the healthcare crisis and frame it in terms of universal health care and why it wouldn't cost more than the kinds of HMO insurance programs we have today, and not let a Bill O'Reilly or Fox TV soundbite it mercilessly as a tax cut and this and that, government, big government, you will reach those people. How we reach those people is a matter of leadership, is a matter of politicians speaking with authenticity, I think, which is something people want, which is why they like a McCain, whose positions many I don't agree with, but he speaks as a maverick.
I totally agree with you. You have to, people will accept differences of opinion, but they want some opinions.
Which is why the Democrats
want that obvious reflection of the poll taken the day before.
Which is why, in 2002, in this past election, the Democrats seemed to speak without conviction or conscience, and to be so poll-driven that it turned Americans off who were seeking conviction.
So what we're looking at are different campaign techniques and a different campaign structure. The primaries, the use of television, the cost of all of this, plus the emergence of all these polls that have really had a very detrimental effect, I think, on our political system.
Terrible effect. I think we may see a backlash against that, again, in this authenticity sphere.
Yeah.
And I think we see across the country, not to be too bleak, we see the rise of political reform, grassroots movements that speak to the quandary we're in. For example, the clean money. It's going to take a while. It's going to come from the states. It's not going to happen in Washington, D.C. But already I think it's a quarter of the Maine legislature, and maybe the Arizona governor was elected in some of Arizona's legislature, so not just the East Coast. We're seeing people who aren't as mortgaged to lobbyists and money. So you see a different kind of politics. 'Cause I'm not reductionist, but you can't ignore the force of money. The drug companies alone have more lobbyists in Washington than there are members of Congress.
Well, just reading about the recent regulations that are proposed at the SEC following these giant corporate scandals, and they're going to still water them down because of all the lobbying. I'm fascinated with all the activity on the internet about the war and the different techniques that are now thing, and I think finally they're coming together. I think the people on the internet have been younger and they're used to communicating that way, but I think they're beginning to see the value of an actual visual presence and importance of that visually. So they're taking ads out in papers. More people are joining the demonstrations.
Well, I think the internet activism is very important. You have Move On, you have True Majority. The Nation has a website where we, in 3 hours, this was about 6 months ago, we moved 30,000 letters to protest the nomination of Pickering. Now he's back. We'll do it again. This is the Bush's appointment to one of the circuit courts. I think the internet is a terrific tool, and there are young people who know how to use it. At the same time, you still need those protests in the street. And then you see the curious throwback to the old time ads, if people in groups can put together the money, where, for example, you have the ad that was run in '64 against Barry Goldwater. The anti-war groups are running that Daisy ad.
Yes, so it's so interesting, isn't it?
So you have a whole network of a whole community of activism that's new and exciting. But I would just add, most Americans still get their news from their local papers, which are run by Gannett chains, and from TV. And what we're seeing in the next few months may be the final consolidation of our media, with Michael Powell, Colin Powell's son at the FCC, leading to more conglomeratization, sensationalism on TV, and fewer independent voices, less journalism. And what that will do in terms of our democracy, where you need a marketplace of ideas to sound old-fashioned, and people will not see their own lives represented on TV. I mean, think about, again, to go back to healthcare and unemployed, where do people who are without healthcare or unemployed or trying to make sense of this country turn to on TV?
The number of people who don't have health insurance
is staggering.
It's unbelievable. And the importance of the health insurance in trying to get a job or keeping a family going, and the cost of it if you don't have a job. And
what you see on TV, and this is again part of what you were talking about in a broader sense, the Democratic Party moving. Well, our economy has moved from we're collective. There was a sense of a shared story, not to be naive about it, but there was a shared story about economic, a kind of mixed market. Now in the last 20, 30 years, there's been a kind of market fundamentalism and deregulation and privatization, with all the impact that has on citizens mobilizing or moving to action. So now, on TV in the last few years, you have more drug ads, which lead people, if they have the resources, to go to their doctors and say, I want Viagra or I want Claritin, and more of that than actual coverage of what's going on in a country. A great industrialized nation, which again is isolated from the world in its experience about simple things like healthcare.
The newspapers in the local communities, I mean, I'm always shocked when I go into a different city and read the local newspapers. You have to rely more and more on AP, which is always a reliable, I think, reporter of record, but they don't carry the stories, or they have more features. They've got more local ads. It's in a lot of places, it is not a good source for any information on news.
My experience, and again, I'm a provincial, I will admit. I'm born and raised in New York City, but I believe, in the decency and wisdom of the American people. I think a progressive politics that doesn't is dead on arrival. But I have traveled in the last year to Mooresville, North Carolina, where half my family lives. They left Nutley, New Jersey 15 years ago. This is NASCAR territory. This is the home of Dale Earnhardt, a man who I had not heard of until Time magazine put him on the cover, confirming my bluedom. And I've been to Owensboro, Kentucky, where my husband is from. And in both places, I have to say, the newspapers, at least the editorial pages, were, one was about the South evolving and changing, and about the growth of the Latino population and the importance and value of immigration. This was in North Carolina. And in Owensboro, it was about the poor quality of schools and the need for equalized funding. These were the lead editorials, and these were local papers. So I think that there's a stirring in the country, and you see that again in not just the opposition to the war, but the ambivalence. I mean, today the polls show 7 in 10 Americans want inspections to continue. And if you looked at D.C. last weekend, you saw people coming from Maine to Columbus, Ohio, to, all kinds of small...
It was a thrilling thing to watch. So how do people, do you think, make up their minds about issues?
I think a lot of it is your own life. I mean, which is why the economy has always been such a dominant issue in our politics.
But you might feel something. And my feeling was you could instinctively feel something as a result of the way you were brought up, or where you were brought up, and your own life. But it needs to be validated by a person of stature that you think is an expert in something. And of course, as the older you get, you realize
who's an expert, what is an expert,
and what they're lacking when they say they're experts, and all the self-promotion. So that's always been important, I think, of why public officials should take more public stands that aren't necessarily the most popular.
Absolutely, that aren't poll-driven.
Because you need, I mean, they're going to uncover many feelings.
They will tap and draw out what is latent. Maybe.
But if we don't have that,
I think people find leadership in different places now.
Yeah.
I mean, I think leadership is not necessarily electoral leadership. People find it,
they have to.
I guess, in celebrities or in people who are leading movements. But
name some of those people.
Well, I think in in the globalization movement, there's an interest in being non-hierarchical, but there are people who are speaking. And then you think of the leaders who, Jimmy Carter, I think, has spoken to a strain in America that is genuine and is even confirmed by polls, which is a belief that America needs to be part of a community of nations, leading, not dominating. So he becomes the rare case of an ex-president who hasn't gone off to golf or raise a son who gets appointed to the White House. But Mandela is one. I mean, these are people around the world. I think Mikhail Gorbachev is a great leader who liberated Eastern Europe.
An unbelievable leader
who speaks still.
But we need to see much more of him.
We'll have
to talk about him in a minute. Yeah. But it's fewer and fewer people that we do have, and then at the same time, when you have the collapse of the church hierarchy, you've got so much doubting of what we used to consider to be traditional authority. So maybe that's good. I think that is good.
Skepticism is good. I think cynicism leads to demobilization and apathy.
Right.
But there are wonderful people leading groups around this country, and new progressive people in state legislatures. I think there's a woman, April Fairfield, I think in North Dakota, has just been elected, and elected in the Wellstone model. Yeah. There's a Hmong immigrant woman who's in the state senate in Minnesota. These are people who speak to their ideals. They're elected. Or there's a man who's heading a youth leadership in an opposition to the death penalty center in San Francisco. I mean, people who speak on issues. Yeah.
And we have to really do that. Let's talk a little bit about Russia, Soviet Union. You that was a field of special interest to you, an area of special
Absolutely.
interest.
Largely
How did that happen?
Well, largely in two ways. One, I had always been interested in the McCarthy period in this country. The Joe McCarthy period, not the Eugene McCarthy period.
But that was another fascinating thing, and you look back on that now and you realize we were paralyzed by that era and that crazy man. I mean, he was
and it was a broad phenomenon. It wasn't just
unbelievable how many people were cowed by the sense of authority. So it goes back to what's an expert,
right?
And all the self-promotion and that.
And it goes back to the decimation of an American left, because in the 20s and 30s, you had a more radical populist American left, and what the McCarthy period did was brand it as one that was foreign. And you see the resonance today with the loyalty, oaths, the fear of being charged as unpatriotic, un-American. So I found that always interesting.
And of course, we had a mayor that instilled it. I had never been called the old left or something, and Giuliani, that he always brought that term up and always used it as a denigration. Yeah.
And so, a lot of that period was about Americans' fascination or fear of Soviet Russia. And then also my husband was a professor, still is at NYU, was at Princeton then, of Soviet history and politics. I went first in '78. It was a fascinating time, and then had the good fortune to be sort of in the front row of the Gorbachev, Perestroika, Glasnost period. At that time in this country, politics was more quiescent. But in Russia, you could see the hope of a new country and system being born. It's changed now. There's great grimness and bleakness in terms of the economy and obviously just governance. But I worked at a Russian newspaper and covered the first parliamentary elections. Saw all these political people emerge, many young ones. Saw Sakharov released. And Steve and I then wrote a book together called Voices of Glasnost with some of the leading reformers who had been in sort of Gorbachev's kitchen cabinet and later in his government. And our daughter had the good fortune, or ill fortune as she may consider later, to first visit when it was still the Soviet Union at 2 months, just before the coup plot, the coup. She's been there now more than 30 times. And if it wasn't the end of the Cold War and there was no real sort of worldwide I'd worry that she'd be, she might become a radical right-winger in terms of this infliction upon her of Russia.
I went to the Soviet Union just before it fell. It was my first time. I was invited as a city council member to go to a forum there of other local representatives from around the world to talk to newly elected members of the city councils in different areas. And it was a fascinating trip for me because I grew up during the Cold War. And I was astonished at this place. At first it was in December, so it was freezing cold. A lot of snow. The lines, the red tape, the boundaries for people, what they couldn't do, what they could do, and how lacking it was at that time in any kind of fast energy or something. But it astounded me. I thought, this is what we've been fearing for so many years. But that was, it seems to me,
what a waste of resources. The trillions spent on wasted arms.
Unbelievable.
And now, my father came and visited me when I was living there in 1989. He'd never been. Of course, he'd thought about Soviet Russia for all of his life. He was so astounded by the poverty. And this was Moscow, which is the privileged city. Today, I will say just briefly, what's so sad is that democracy has become associated with corruption and in sort of Western values of the worst sort. So that has really lost its value. There are no lines, but the prices, the costs, and the poverty in that country are still staggering. There are major parts of the country that go without heat in this winter. We're sitting here in New York City in a cold spell, which is minor compared to Russia. Moscow's filled with sushi restaurants, Versace across from the former KGB offices, but a tiny percentage, and it doesn't even compare to our inequality, which is large, can afford these goods. So it's a grim picture, and of course press freedom is eroding. You got a former KGB head as president of the country, and we've allowed in the name of this fight against terrorism, not just in Russia but around the world, is we've allowed countries to repress human rights in the name of the fight against terrorism. So the situation in Chechnya is just horrific. The number of civilians who've been killed in the 2 wars in the last years, and Grozny, the capital of Chechnya, makes Dresden after World War II look like a vibrant city. So what kind of generation will emerge from Chechnya? I think we saw a terrible inkling of in that hostage crisis situation in the Moscow theater a couple months ago.
What's happened to Gorbachev, and is he cynical as a result of what happened to him? And
he's kind of a Jimmy Carter figure. I wanted to write a piece last summer. I didn't have a chance, but we've now known him quite well for almost 10 years. He is a man who speaks about the opportunities lost, which he saw so clearly, because he, if anyone ended the Cold War, he did, and obviously forces contributed to that. But he sees the opportunities lost in building a better world with the, and so he speaks about that. He travels. He runs a group called Global Green International. There's a Global Green USA in California, which works on everything from water problems around the world to sustainable development. And it's a very vibrant group. He also participates in his own country's politics. He was reviled for many years because he was linked to the end of a country, and people had such pride. You can't. But in the last years, a younger generation, and don't forget, I mean, they were tiny when Perestroika began, has come back to rediscovering what he did. So that's exciting. And I have to say, what's curious is when his wife died, and they were really a truly unique and genuine political couple. When she died a few years ago of cancer, there was great sympathy in Russia, which is not to generalize, it's a very emotional, loving country when it's not gripped by, fear and anger. So there was a return of sympathy for Gorbachev.
I hope he does.
But he's doing good things, and he's very vibrant. I mean, and compared to Yeltsin, who's sort of mummified because of, who was the hero of of the Clinton administration, sadly, which put all of its eggs in his basket, and we saw the result.
So are Gorbachev and Carter friendly?
Gorbachev and Carter are similar, and but I have to say, and you can't blame Gorbachev because his moment was so linked to Bush Sr., who really worked with him to end the Cold War, and also Margaret Thatcher, who treated Gorbachev very kindly when he first emerged in '85. He has great sentiment for them. But Carter is much more of his spirit, and also he has a strange relationship with Putin, who he keeps thinking is going to emerge as a social democrat. I think some of that is he was treated so badly by Yeltsin, and Putin at least has shown Gorbachev some respect as a former leader. So again, a personal, political.
Right. Yeah. So let's go back to this country, and who do we listen to about the war in Iraq? I think, in a way, Maybe we don't have to listen to anybody anymore because it's becoming so much common sense.
Well, I wish it was. And again, I think common sense is a great word, because I think, to go back to like Tom Paine,
Yes.
there's a common sense politics that
Yes.
appeals to people, not left, right.
Right.
I think, and you'll laugh at this maybe, Ronnie. I mean, one person to listen to in the last months has been Teddy Kennedy,
I
who
know.
gave another good
I
speech
know.
yesterday. This is where we're at, you know.
Yeah.
But there are others, and I think there's a common sense that has pushed people, Americans, to understand that this war doesn't have a connection to Al-Qaeda and September 11th. It's a
Right.
distraction from a more imminent threat. And I think that is going to move. But here's the danger.
And it's also threatening in itself. that
Absolutely. It would lead to retaliation against a
Absolutely.
country where the other day the Republicans tried to cut money for first responders, for public health that might respond in case of a terrorist attack.
I'm always so surprised at people who are such strong supporters of Israel and Sharon that they aren't speaking out, because it seems to me
Makes
the
Israel
one
less
thing
secure.
that unites the whole Arab world is
Makes
their
Israel-
dislike and intense hatred of Israel.
Yeah, I think...
I don't understand that. And they've been singularly quiet, haven't they, on this?
Absolutely. And I think supportive of the war in the view that it will reshape the Middle East to make Israel more secure. I think that, the narrowness of debate
Yeah.
about Israel is also worrisome, because I think one should be able to criticize the Likud government or Sharon
Absolutely.
and not be labeled,
Right.
anti-Semitic, which I
Right.
think has happened.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. Let's go back, because common sense, I think, is a
Yeah.
very important thing.
Yeah.
It's true in everything. And if people only had more, it always reminded me of the women's movement and what I learned then. If you have more confidence in yourself and your
Yeah.
ability to look at something and say it makes no sense, you would feel more comfortable with politics.
That's right, and that goes to what you were saying earlier, which is don't let the experts speak. You should
Yeah.
speak, but people do need to get information and feel emboldened.
And-
where they get information goes back to our media conversation. But I think as people are emboldened, and you see that now against the war, or you see, for example, on the tax cut. It's important not to forget that the first tax cut, which is going to strip our cities and our fiscal common
Right.
sense of possibilities, was not a majority position. People wanted, when asked, to invest it in education, Social Security, or health care, but it was rammed through, and that's where the money comes in. Also, but the disconnect in our democracy, the fact that we may go to war when you have a United States isolated, not only, this administration isolated not only in the world community, but now, against a majority of its own citizens. You wonder, what are the levers of democracy, how weakened they've become if this is now the case.
And we have to say goodbye. It's a half hour.
Oh, wow.
already. Thank you very
Thank you.
much. It's wonderfully stimulating to talk to you, and
Thank
I love
you.
it. And it's not only that we agree, but we're both optimistic about saving the world. And
Yeah.
I think that the viewers can see why The Nation is a magazine they should be reading.
Thank you.